Devyn Friedfel, and Devyn is Pepperwood's natural resource specialist. And in that role, he supports our preserve manager, Michael Galogli, in managing the natural resources and infrastructure on site. Devyn runs our volunteer workdays in the field and assists with the Sentinel site research projects. Devyn holds a bachelor's degree in environmental studies and economics from UC Santa Cruz. And we also have with us today Jason Mills, and Jason is a restoration and fire ecologist, botanist, and licensed California tree landscape contractor, and certified ecological restoration practitioner with over 15 years of experience in the field. He received his MS with distinction for his thesis on prescribed fire in California grasslands and continues to research the effects of invasive plant control methodology in conjunction with restoration practices, and currently uses these skills to effectively guide the management practices of all Sonoma Ecology Center's restoration department projects. So I don't think I mentioned it here, but Jason is the restoration program manager at Sonoma Ecology Center. And with that, I will pass it on to Jason at this time.
All right. Hello, everyone. Thanks for taking the time to join us. This is a really important field. This is a really important line of work, and it's imperative that we involve the community in these efforts. A lot of times I see mixed messaging out there when people see us out there attacking these invasive species. It's not that we're out to kill these plants, but we're actually killing them in order to preserve life itself. So I feel like really fortunate that we actually have, I think, the opportunity to do this. And I think it's probably one of the best jobs on Earth to care for life itself. And this life is hard earned. Through the process of evolution, it has basically shaped biodiversity, and it is a hard-earned battle. Speciation occurs over millennia of time, shaped by so many environmental conditions, so that each one of these species is perfectly suited to occupy their niche habitats. And it has just made the natural world such a wonderful place to be in. And this is something that really intrigues me personally. It's like, how long did it take these species to form these evolutionary relationships? You know, it's kind of hard to say specifically. We work off fossil records and pollen evidence, but you know, we have conifers dating back 300 million years, mammals over 200 million years, birds over 150 million years, flowering plants go 140 million years back, Homo sapiens ourselves just over 1 million years, and Homo sapiens in California thought to be between 10 to now I think 20,000 years, and Western colonialism only in the past 500 years, and we're having quite an impact on our landscape. So when I taught evolution and ecology at Chico State, I just got grilled with wonderful questions by my students, and it just got me thinking more and more about, you know, how all of these evolutionary processes actually went about shaping our current state of diversity, and that those core principles of Charles Darwin and survival of the fittest, and each one of these species developing these traits to allow them to flourish, is what has kind of shaped our current landscape. And it's kind of not so straightforward as actually survival of the fittest. And one of the things I really love about, you know, these advancements in our understandings is the field of ecology itself is a fairly new science, and it is really focused on the web of life and the species interactions and how each of these species support each other. So it might not be so simple as survival of the fittest when we actually look at species facilitating other species survival through symbiotic relationships. And here in California, we have a wonderful variety of amazing ecological communities. Each of these microclimates have given rise to such a unique distribution of species within these highly variable communities, from old growth redwoods to the Mojave Sonoran Desert to the high alpine white mountain bristlecone pines, or our coastal areas still intact on the Lost Coast. And many of these ecosystems are unfortunately currently facing constraint and peril. We're also coming to learn more about, it's not just what we're seeing with our eyes, but what's going on underneath in our soils, and how this matrix of mycorrhizal networks is actually supporting species to species transfer of energy and sugars and water and nutrients. And it's just a fascinating thing we're just starting to tap into. These ephemeral plants, right? These are mycotrophic flowers that are tapped into those mycorrhizal networks, and they are the ephemeral species that we lose when we degrade landscapes. These are plants we can't restore. We can't go and propagate them in a native plant nursery. They are really unique, and it's these sort of ephemeral species that make nature such a wonderfully diverse place. And when we look at what's going on these days, we have removed ourselves from native plant ecosystems, and we've altered them by introducing plants. Now, I think it's important to categorize each one of these plants, because just because a plant is exotic does not mean it's bad. An introduced plant only poses a threat when it's able to not only escape and survive in the wild, but overtake and displace native vegetation. So an ornamental plant you pay for, something you desire, a rose or an apple, yes, it might require extra water or fertilizer to perform. That might have minor consequences to the environment, but really when those plants turn invasive is when they are overtaking and displacing native species, forming monotypic stands which eliminate biodiversity and resources for wildlife. Now, these plants are directly introduced by us, either intentionally or unintentionally. And what are they out there displacing? I mean, an incredible array of a magnificent biodiversity. I mean, California flora, there are over 5,000 native species found in California, a biodiversity hotspot on Earth. When I'm not in the field doing this strenuous work, I'm off exploring nature with my camera, trying to find new species, and it's just been a wonderful thing, and really is very inspiring to have a hand in protecting these things. On the top row there, we have our calocordyces, kind of the poster child of California flora, with so many interesting endemic species and so many variable traits. And there on the far right, we have Calocordyce uniflora, present here in Sonoma County, a rare plant. Fourth from the right there, Lilium rubescens, our chaparral lily, also a rare species present in the Mayakama. And, the mimuluses, now Erythranthe and Diplicus, splitting, finding more and more species out there. Some of them are rare. We are still kind of taxonomically actively dividing mimulus as they are evolving and actively speciating. So it's an exciting place to be. And these native species are essentially the building blocks for ecological communities, and each one of them is providing a very valuable resource to support wildlife. So the Dutch pipevine, it is the larval host for the pipevine swallowtail. So the pipevine swallowtail lays its eggs on the Dutch pipevine plant, then their larval form or caterpillars specifically depend on that plant for forage to metamorphosize to form the pipevine swallowtail. And as we know, the milkweeds provide a vital food source for monarch butterflies and also in turn provide them with a chemical defense through asclepicin to defend them from predation. So these sort of complex relationships we're coming to know, but there are many more we are still learning about. I just found out the sphinx moth, kind of like Darwin's moth there, with a long proboscis, goes down and pollinates our primroses. I'm sure we're all familiar with seeing the hummingbirds come by this time of year and visit our California fuchsias and the epilobiums, providing a vital nectar resource when a lot of the other plants out there are dormant. And here we have the seed pod of the pipevine plant, which I just found out from collecting the seeds and drying them. Vespid wasps were coming to not only eat the vegetation of the pod, but actually distribute the seeds in the process. And I also just learned that trillium seeds are distributed by ants in the redwood forest. So it is just amazing. And every time we're displacing and damaging these plants, we are dramatically having an impact on the natural diversity on our planet. And it becomes imperative that we learn about these functions in order to protect them properly. And if we look at the state of biodiversity across the United States, look at the emphasis in California. I mean, we are in the biological hotspot. We need to do everything we can to save these species, because once they're gone, we can't get them back. And they took a millennia to form. And how are we losing these plants? We're losing them to direct development itself, paving over them, displacing habitat, and along the way, introducing invasive species, which then wipe out biodiversity. So why would we go about doing anything about it? Well, I feel as though since we are directly responsible for introducing these plants, it is up to us to fix the problem we started. Why would we do this? Well, there, in many cases, are direct economic impacts. Yellow star thistle degrading forage for livestock, or arundo clogging waterways for cargo to move. These plants could also be providing beneficial medicine or food that we still haven't learned about. And there are also the moral implications of each one of these organisms has a right to exist on our planet. We don't get to determine what survives and what doesn't. And I think, Devyn's going to go into much more detail on, ecological approaches on how we address some of these top-tiered invasive species. But from doing this work for over 20 years now, one thing I've come to observe is that when you're kind of narrowly focused on eradication, it can often get you the short-term results, but in order to actually get long-term results, it makes a lot of sense to look at this on a more holistic level and actually see these invasive species as being symptomatic repercussions of disturbance that are actually now fulfilling a niche role that a native species most likely supplied. So when we go into a site, I like to assess the resource distributions of that site. What's the history of land use disturbance there? Are there still native plants and resources available, or have they all been diminished? If so, how long have these invasive species been here? How deep does their seed bank go? And that determines whether you're going to need to have a more active role without planting native plants, or whether you're going to have a more passive approach and just controlling the invasives and letting the natives replenish on their own. And I think there's been a lot of controversy on thinking that these native species are somehow inadequate or cannot competitively compete with these new invasive introduced species. And Seabloom with Cal Academy and my research showed that actually that's not the case. And if you level the resource allocation between the two, native species can compete. They have just been displaced and disproportionately allocated through our land use history of heavy grazing and heavy disturbance and heavy displacement. And when you do this properly, I believe it is possible to shift these invasion curves and change trajectories and actually reestablish that competitive hierarchy in favor of native species. And I think one of the keys to this is going to be looking at co-geners and family relatives of these invasive plants and developing restoration plans that provide a replacement for that invasive species with a related native species to bring it full circle again. So with that, I will pass it over to Devyn to dive into more of the ecological approaches we use in this field. And we'll circle back at the end to answer specific questions.
All right, thank you, Jason. I am attempting to do this. Give me one.
While Devyn is getting his slides up, I just want to invite folks again to add your questions or comments in the chat, and then we can direct those to both Devyn and Jason at the end.
All right, well, thank you, Jason. That was a wonderful introduction of why we should care about managing our invasive plants. So I am gonna dive a little bit more into some approaches, and now that we're convinced that we wanna take on an invasive plant role, I'll kind of walk us through some of the processes that we can kind of go through to get there. I'm gonna throw a lot of information at you, but if you want follow-up questions, please type them in and we'll respond. And I'm also available in the future. I loved answering invasive species questions or kind of helping people with anything specific, and I'm sure Jason's the same. So please feel free to reach out in the future. There's gonna be a lot of information coming at you. So bear with me, it's all pretty important though. So this is kind of just basically what I'm gonna kind of go through in the presentation, talking about knowing your goals and why that's important, and how to make a plan and what should be in that plan, thinking about prevention and kind of stopping the invasive species from getting onto your land, understanding the kind of biology and life cycle of the target species can really help you make a better approach to eradicating it if you understand a little bit more. And then kind of some resources that maybe you can look into, kind of understanding what invasive species are potentially around you and what you should be keeping your eyes out for. And then kind of how to prioritize. There's a lot of invasive species out there, and making the best approach and how you can kind of get the most bang for your effort. And then it's really important to monitor. So I'm just gonna, that's basically what my presentation is gonna be about. And starting off with kind of knowing your goal. So I think Jason kind of dove into that pretty well by saying, you know, there's a lot of reasons we'd want to go after invasive species. For us at Pepperwood, and I know at Sonoma Ecology Center, protecting biodiversity is a huge component, and that's really our main driving force for removing invasive species. But there's economic reasons. Potentially, if you have yellow star thistle crowding out and you're losing potential forage, removing that can actually be better for your agricultural component. And maybe you just have some Italian thistles in your backyard and they're really pokey and they bug the heck out of you, and you want to be able to go walk in your backyard and not get stabbed in the leg. Also, protecting against fuel loads. I think we're seeing it now. A lot of these invasive species post-fire are potentially adding a lot of ladder fuel too. I think of the Mark West Springs area after it burned in the Tubbs fire, and there is a ton of French broom coming up, and that's creating a lot of ladder fuel that could potentially let the fire continuously kind of move through there. So thinking about invasive species as a fuel source for wildfires too is another good one. And there's another numerous of other potential reasons why we'd want to go after invasive species. But I think it's really important to come back to this goal. You'll have long days in the field and you'll get tired, and it's a long process to go after invasive species. So kind of always remembering why you're trying to reach this goal. You're not removing the invasive species just to kill plants, like Jason said. We're doing this to kind of accomplish something. So I encourage you to write that down and then always reflect back on that when you feel a little discouraged, or kind of like, wait, why was I doing this again? Really important to come back to that goal. So making a plan, once you kind of know what species you want to target and kind of have your goal, in mind, you can kind of work backwards in understanding how to get there. So how much time and energy you're willing to put into a project is really important to define yourself. Give yourself those boundaries. Maybe you're not willing to spend any money, but you have 8 hours every weekend you're willing to devote to it. That's a really important thing for you to know when you're making your plan. Defining your financial and effort parameters of what you're willing to kind of spend and put into this project. And then kind of understanding the species and the biology of it. Is it an annual? Is it a biannual? Is it a perennial? I'll dive a little bit more into that and how we can approach each of those, but just kind of knowing how to categorize your plants too. And then picking your strategies. Maybe hand pulling is going to be a really effective way to get rid of it, but maybe that population's too big, so hand pulling is totally not feasible given you're only willing to spend 4 hours a month working on it. So maybe you want to think about spending a little bit of money and hiring a contract crew, or you're willing to maybe use a chemical on that plant because it'll make your time efficiency that much better. And then establishing some monitoring protocols. I'll talk a little bit more about that, but it's really important to understand how our progress is going. If it's successful and we're making good progress, or maybe it's not being successful and we need to change up our plans a little bit. So when we make this plan, know that they're always fluid, and we're always going to be checking in with them and kind of maybe shifting them slightly. I really encourage you to kind of write these out so you can revisit them, and it just kind of helps you think through the process. So now that we kind of know what we're going for, we kind of have a plan, we kind of want to understand where this plant's coming from. Because if we're putting all this time and energy into removing this plant, but our next door neighbor who's downwind from us has that same plant and it's blowing into our yard every year, we kind of want to stop that too. So we don't want to be putting too much time and energy into a project that is just going to be perpetual. So we need to understand how these seeds are moving into the area where we do have our invasive species. So we want to stop them at the source. Avoiding unnecessary soil disturbance. Invasive species are really, really good at taking over freshly disturbed areas. So the less soil disturbance, the less likely we're going to have an area where invasive species can move. I encourage you to talk to your neighbors, get to know your neighborhood and what's in your community. Get to know your land. Can be really helpful. Maybe they have an insight of something that you don't. Or maybe you can share something with them that they're unaware of. So encouraging to talking to neighbors, getting to know your community, both the ecological community and your human community, and just having conversations about them, I think can be really beneficial to just kind of get everyone on the same page and understand what's out there and what we should be concerned about with invasive species. I know a lot of us have dealt with wildfires in the last few years. That is a big disturbance where invasive species can kind of move in. So I totally encourage everybody after a large disturbance to take time to survey your land. The more time we spend on the land, the better we will recognize patterns that we aren't used to. So we'll see an invasion come in once we know what's out there. If we're not spending that much time on our land, the harder it will be to spot new things coming in. So that I think is the biggest thing. The more we understand the ecology of our land on this kind of large scale and what plants exist in there, the better we'll recognize a new invader. So also kind of understanding that the timing cycle, spring is really I think probably the best time to identify new invasive species or invasive species population. This is a picture of Romulea rosa, and you see those pretty little pink flowers there. And then these green long grass stems. That's what the vegetative state looks like. It looks like a grass, really, really hard to ID. But as soon as those flowers come out, it makes it a lot easier. So spring is a great time to kind of do some surveying because a lot of the plants are in flower and we can kind of detect them a lot faster and easier. So stopping seeds at the source. If we see a bunch of an invasive plant that's fully seeding, like this milk thistle here, really important to kind of like stop the seeds at the source. What I would do in this situation is I would have a plastic bag and some snippers, take all that seed and take as much of it and put it in the bag and remove it from the site. So just if we do see seed sources, we want to stop them at the beginning. Some potential vectors of things moving in, vehicles, heavy equipment, if we've had any road work done recently, or a new building potentially put in, those are big vectors of creating soil disturbance, and also have seeds potentially in them. Our clothes and our boots, you can see this bottom right corner is my boot after walking through a Medusa head field. So even if we go on a walk at a state park, we could potentially pick up some invasive species and bring them home. So paying attention of what seeds we're moving on our clothes and our boots is really important, especially if we're somebody that likes to go out and hike and go to areas that have good intact habitat. So we don't want to spread seeds onto our land, and we don't want to spread invasives onto other state parks or other intact habitats. So we're big vectors of spreading these seeds. Animals are another really big one. If we have cattle or sheep, can get caught in their fur and they can move it, or if we're bringing in hay or feed, invasives can kind of move with that too. I've recently started to realize that a lot of invasives are moving in the wind, especially in the fall, and we have the late seeding, some of the late seeding invasives like stinkwort, and we have these big Diablo wind events where we're getting really kind of heavy winds. They're actually able to move these seeds like potentially up to a mile or more. So being aware of where the wind current's coming from, and maybe what's coming in with the wind. And then waterways. Seeds move downhill, and they move with water. So just thinking of how the seeds move is a good way to kind of potentially understand where your invasive sources are coming from. So knowing the life cycle of your target species can be a really beneficial tool of picking an approach to eradicating that invasive. So I kind of like to break the invasives up into these 4 categories. I think you can kind of fit everything into these 4 categories, and they each have slightly different approaches that will benefit you when you're trying to eradicate. So annuals, biennials, perennials, and woody species, and so I'll dive right into those. So annual species basically are species that live for one season or 1 year, and they put all their energy into producing as many seeds as possible, and spreading those seeds so that next year you'll have even more seeds, and then they'll do the same thing, and you'll kind of get a population exponential growth really quickly. So the 2 main kind of approaches you want to take with annuals is stopping the plant from producing more seeds, and then exasperating the seed bank. So even if I have, say, barbed goatgrass is one annual plant that I deal with quite frequently. Even if I eradicate every single plant and I've gone back and I've made really sure I've got every plant, I didn't let a single one seed, I still need to go back to that population next year and make sure that the seeds from the prior year aren't germinating again. Because even if I am able to stop the seed source entirely, I need to follow up and keep doing that until I've totally let all those seeds regerminate that are in the soil, and I've removed them all. So it can be tedious and long lasting, and sometimes seed banks on annuals can last anywhere to like maybe 10 years is on the high end, I think, but I think typically it's like 4 years. So being really diligent for at least those 4 years and really kind of removing the invasive species. And then once you don't see any, go back the next year and just check it out. I think working with invasive species is a great way to be more in touch with your landscape and the ecology of the land. It's causing you to look, and we shouldn't see scouting and going out and doing this work as like difficult work. It's encouraging us to be out there and work with the land. I think it's something that maybe people that are probably in this enjoy being in the outdoors. So this is a great way to force you to be in the outdoors. So prioritizing invasive species will get us out on the land more. So I think that's a good thing. And I think that's a thing a lot of people are looking for. So some really good control methods with annuals is mowing before it goes to seed. So if you have some of these annual grasses, maybe bolting, but their seeds aren't viable yet, that's a great time to go out and mow it because they've sent all their energy up to create these seeds. The seeds aren't viable yet, and we'll cut back all that biomass. So the plant is kind of exhausted and tired. They might still likely have another seeding round, but it's going to be a lot shorter and probably less seeds. So we'll maybe have to do a second mowing follow-up. So even though we've reduced the first round of seeds, they still have another opportunity to maybe create seed again that same season. Hand pulling, so just grabbing the plant and removing it from the root system and taking the whole seed and kind of bagging that and pulling it off site. This is a picture on the right of barbed goat grass, an invasive species I get to deal with a lot. And for those of you that have come up and volunteered here at Pepperwood in the spring, you've probably gotten the opportunity to be in the hot sun and pull it with me. But that's one where I can hand pull and bag it. But we have really small populations, so it's really feasible for me to take that. If these populations were a lot bigger, I'd probably be consider mowing, or if they get big enough, maybe flaming or using prescribed fire that can cover these larger land masses. Grazing is another potential option. So time grazing can work, and using animals is a really blunt tool. They are hard to control, and the timing is really hard to get with animals. They can also be a vector of seed, like I mentioned before. So it is a potential option, timed grazing, to reduce annuals, but it can be tricky, and you could, if not timed right, you could actually potentially spread the seeds. Solarizing is a method. It's basically covering a landmass in kind of a black plastic to increase the heat to kind of kill all the seeds. So that'll actually help reduce your seed bank along with the vegetative state. This works well in landscape areas and kind of small, manageable patches. Using large pieces of plastic over large landscapes doesn't really work. The wind kind of blows, flaps the plastic will break down over time. And then when you remove that plastic, you have a blank slate, which is a heavily disturbed area and a great place for invasives to move in. So if you are doing solarizing, you really need to follow up with some competitive planting or mulching to kind of add some competition for those invasives right away. It's nice because it gives you a clean slate and you can work with it, but if you don't do anything with that clean slate, invasives will just kind of come right back. Mulching is another way. It's kind of another thing that needs to be paired with something else. It's basically spreading like cardboard or wood chips is a really popular mulch across a landscape to kind of suffocate the vegetation. Over a year, things will kind of start coming back through the mulch. So just throwing mulch out for a year, it works, but you kind of need another follow-up. Kind of like Jason was saying, is that mulching is a much more active restoration method. So you kind of want to be putting plants into the ground with it. And then with annuals, especially some of these grasses, you think you get every single one, but you probably didn't. So doing a follow-up, even if you think you totally eradicated, coming back in a week and just kind of poking your eyes, you might catch 10, 20 more plants, but that's maybe 100 seeds, meaning 100 plants for next year, rather than potentially 10 plants or something. So I encourage you to go back even if you think you got them all. And then there's still the seed bank. So the seeds are still sitting in that seed bank for years to come. So just going back and following up and being diligent about it. It's really exciting and rewarding to come back the next year and be like, oh, whoa, look at how small this population is. And then also on the other side, it's like, whoa, does it seem like this population has actually grown? What did I do wrong last year? What can I change about my methods this year that will maybe make me a little bit more successful? Biannuals, it's really kind of the same concept as annuals. Your two approaches are preventing new seed production and depleting the existing seed bank. They can be a little bit more difficult because biannuals have a large taproot. They often can flower for 2 years. And that large taproot allows them to draw energy and store energy in it. So even if you go through and you time it after it's bolted and use some of its energy, but it's not going to seed, or it's just starting to flower and has a chance to go to seed, and you cut it, it's gonna bolt again. Also, they can be really difficult. The timing doesn't seem to be uniform with biannuals. Here's some examples of some biannuals we have at Pepperwood: rush skeleton weed, bull thistles, and teasel. And it's kind of interesting. They'll start to flower for bull thistle, for example. Will kind of start to flower as early as like June, but I'm currently still seeing it bolting and flowering. So I think the large taproot actually allows it to draw energy from its taproot and kind of send up bolt whatever and start to flower whenever it thinks is the most appropriate time, not making it a uniform flowering season. like the annuals kind of have. So it can be a little tricky. You have to kind of monitor a little bit more. But one good approach with this is actually removing the entire taproot. So if you pulled one of these thistles out, you'd notice they have this really long taproot. So if you're able to get that taproot out, you're removing that stored energy, so it won't be able to kind of rebolt. And then something like rush skeleton weed, you can't get that taproot out. It bolts in like kind of late summer in really hard ground. And even if you leave just a chunk of that taproot in, it'll kind of grow. So that's something we don't have very much of. I will actually use chemicals on that. An aster-specific chemical. It works really well. The plant will absorb it into its taproot, and I can just spray it, a little bit of spray on once, and it'll fully kill the plant, so I don't have to kind of repetitively go back because they're kind of dispersed all over the place. And given you're working with 3,000 acres, it's kind of hard to do successfully managed biannuals when they're really spread out and diverse. So some of these species makes more sense to mechanically remove if you can get that taproot. If you have big populations, maybe mowing and following up is a good approach for those. And if you have any really specific questions, I find biannuals to be one of the trickier plants to really get a grasp on. So perennials, these are species that generally have large taproots, will continue to live for many years. And so it's a little bit different. You still definitely want to stop them from producing seed as much as possible, and you got to deplete the seed bank. But they also have other reproductive structures, such as creeping roots or rhizomes or bulbs. The one that I really think of when I think of perennials is Himalayan blackberry. I'm sure everybody's very familiar with that, and probably most of you have a patch on your land or know someone that does. And even if you were able to stop the blackberry from seeding every single year for like 15 years, it's still going to keep creeping and spreading and kind of working its way across the landscape. So you kind of have to like keeping it in check, but it doesn't really matter is how many times you remove it. So our approach with these is we really want to remove the stored energy that is in the root structure. And so this is a graph that kind of shows time on our x-axis and kind of the stored energy on our y-axis. And it shows that as we kind of move to summer in a Mediterranean climate and we get into these drier conditions, the plant's actually depleting a lot of its root energy into its foliage to kind of maintain it because it's not able to absorb moisture and energy from the ground. So it's actually the root system's at its weakest point kind of in that driest, hottest summer months. So if we remove the vegetation at that point, we are actually getting a lot of that stored energy out. So if we can get rid of that top vegetative layer in those hot summer months, we are sucking a lot of that energy out of the root system. And I guarantee they will sprout up again, probably in that same summer period, but that's another time where before the rain comes, if you can go back and get another top removal of that vegetation, you're really exhausting that root structure. So you can get a lot of bang for your buck with just one vegetative removal. Where if I went in and say, middle of winter or beginning of spring, when there's still a lot of nutrients in the ground, and I remove that vegetative layer, the root structure is actually has a lot of energy left. So it's not too much effort for the plant to kind of produce more vegetation right after that. So thinking about the timing when you approach it too, with these perennials, you really want to exhaust the energy seed bank the root structure in the energy in the root structure. So timing that, it can be really important, and following up that same kind of pattern for years can kind of fully exhaust that seed bank. Another great way is thinking with mechanical removal. Also, you can kind of think about it the same way if you do want to treat it with chemicals, treating the chemicals in that time period of that kind of the summer when the plant is root structure has the least amount of energy. So woody plants is kind of, they are almost like a perennial species, but they have a really large root structure. So a plant that comes to mind when I think of woody plants is acacia or silver wattle or many of the other wattles. But that's something where I can go and cut acacia in the summer in these dry months, like for 15 years, and they're going to keep resprouting because they have so much stored energy in its large root structure that removing the root structure is really going to be the way we get to that. And with something like acacia, it's like really difficult to get that out unless we have heavy equipment or just pure brute force and a big labor force. Maybe a potential good thing is a cut and treat method. So you're removing the top layer of vegetation and then you're adding a small amount of chemical to the open wound of the plant. So the plant will actually absorb that and it'll kind of take it into its root structure and start to decay the root structure. Because just the top vegetation removal can be really difficult or almost impossible with woody species. Another really kind of woody species I think of is French broom, where if you mow French broom and time it right into those hot summer dry months and it doesn't have access to water, maybe in 5 years or a number of years of fully removing it, it'll exhaust that the taproot. But I think an easier method and a much more effective method is to actually fully remove that taproot and pull the plant out. And once you get that taproot out, clearly the plant won't be able to reproduce again. So if you can remove the root structure, I encourage it, but another good approach is removing the top layer of vegetation and then doing a chemical treatment to the plant's open wound. Knowing your invaders and what's around you. So say we're going out and kind of surveying and we're not even really sure what to look for. I know I want to tackle invasive species. My neighbor told me there's some invasive species on my land, but I'm not really sure what I'm looking for. So using the internet, great source. CalFlora is an awesome resource. CalIPSI is another great one. They have maps where people have added their own data, so you can kind of go into your community and look and categorize for invasive species and kind of see what's in your area. And there's wonderful pictures on there, so you kind of know what to look for. Talking to your neighbors, maybe they work on invasive species or maybe they don't. Maybe you can share some information with them or encourage them to do some work on their land too. Don't ever tell anyone what to do on their own land. It'll never lead to a good conversation. But having open resources, maybe offering support, and maybe you could go do a day trade and help them for a day and they can come help you for a day. And early detection, we're only going to find that species, the new species, if we're out there surveying, and we're only going to identify it if we're out there surveying a lot and knowing and are in tune with the ecology of the land we're stewarding. If you see something, say something. CalFlora and iNaturalist are really good ways you can take a picture, upload that photo. There's a bunch of plant nerds out there that will love to tell you exactly what that plant is, and then you can kind of look a little bit into it. So if you're curious about a plant, take a picture, upload it, look into it, and maybe you'll find out it's a really cool native plant, or maybe you'll find out it's an ornamental that it's not a concern, or maybe it's a cool native or invasive that you really got to take on. So doing an inventory, if you find a population, it's really good to identify it too. If you do have access to a GPS, that's a great way. You can take a point. But I personally actually like using flagging or pin flags because when I'm out in another time of the year, I'll see those flags and it'll just kind of key in my brain. Oh, that's right. I got another month before I need to go survey for bark goat grass. But the issue with flagging and pin flags is they do decay over our hot summer months. So making sure you remove them at the end of the year, I'd say they all hold up pretty well for 1 year. Once you get into that second year, you get little pieces of plastic kind of breaking off. So we don't want that. So if you're not going to be diligent about cleaning up your flagging stuff, maybe you could do like a little rock cairn or some visual indicator I personally really like, because at all times of the year, it's good to just get those little reminders. Oh yeah, that's where my population is. I'm getting close to that time of year. Cool, so prioritizing. Say we got a chunk of land and we're, okay, I'm gonna take on invasive species. Jason convinced me, let's do it. Now you need to kind of figure out and you go, oh my goodness, I have so many invasive species here. What do I even do? Thinking about your prioritization, CalIPSI, California Invasive Plant Council, has a great prioritization thing on their website where it basically ranks the invasiveness of plants from watch list 1, 2, and 3. I think 3 is the most invasive. And so using that as a priority, going after those most invasive ones can be really effective. And that's a good way to kind of prioritize yourself. At Pepperwood, we go a little bit more in depth. We have a large piece of land that we have to steward. So we need to prioritize a little bit more. So we also think about feasibility. We go after plants that we can get at that early detection, rapid response. So harding grass is an example that we have a lot of harding grass. It is invasive. It is classified on Calypso's invasive list. I'm not seeing it spreading super fast. I don't feel like it's a big threat to my biodiversity. And it's also going to be all my time if I wanted to tackle harding grass. So we've moved that kind of low into our priorities list because it's really not possible. The work amount is kind of out of our capacity. So we monitor and try and keep it in check and keep it from spreading. But something like stinkwort is something that we're starting to see grow on our land, but it's in a capacity that we still think we can manage it. So we think we can have an effective eradication response to it. So that becomes a priority to us. And just kind of thinking of what's important to you. Maybe you really don't like thistles because you don't like getting stabbed, and the Medusa head grass isn't as bothersome to you. So you're going to prioritize thistles over your invasive annual grass. Figuring out your own prioritization is important, and just kind of thinking that, but sticking with it of kind of why you're prioritizing things. So when we're going into this approach and we've decided the invasive species we're going after, we know where our populations are, now we really want to think about these treatment methods. Mechanical removal, so actually physically getting out there and getting rid of it is really effective. It's labor intensive though. Chemical use, personally my least favorite approach to it, but it's really effective. And if you time it right, you can use really minimal amount of chemicals and get a really good response. In certain species, like I was saying, acacia is one where I think it's almost necessary to kind of take on some chemical use somewhat. Biocontrols, so over in this top right corner, this is a picture of St. John's wort. There is a really great biocontrol out there, the St. John's wort beetle. You see those little silver beetles on there. They were released a couple decades ago, I think, but that was a big invasive problem. We have it on the preserve, but I choose not to manage it out here because I know there's a biocontrol that's going to keep it in check. I might have a spike 1 year in population, but I know that biocontrol exists and they'll knock it back the next year. So the biocontrol keeps in check. So if you have an invasive species, maybe check in to see if there is a active biocontrol out there. And then a combination of things. Maybe we're going to mechanically remove it, and then we're going to add some competitive planting, or we're going to mulch after we mechanically remove it, and then add mechanical planting. And then no treatment is always an option too. If it's something that's not feasible and we think we're going to spend a lot of time, energy, and money into something and we're not going to get that much reward for it, being okay with not treating it as long as it's not too much damaging what we care about. So like I said, with harding grass here, we don't think it's decreasing our biodiversity really at all. It's a really slow spreading. The negative impact from it aren't that big. It does provide forage for animals. That's something we've kind of go, it's a hard decision, but we decide not to treat it other than in really specific areas where we have some sensitive resources. Yeah, so monitoring, really important. We need to know if all of our hard work has been successful or not. Taking a picture in the same place, every year I think is probably the best way. Really easy, really good visual, great way to tell our story at the end and say, hey, look at all this great work we've done. It feels really good too when you get awesome pictures. Individual counts, counting the plants as you pull them is another method. Sometimes you have a population of like 10,000 individual plants. That's not realistic at all. Patch size, how big is your patch and kind of how dense is it? Is it a 20 by 20 meter patch and the density's 30% of the vegetation is this invasive plant? Another way that we kind of do at Pepperwood. And then effort by time is another good way too. I spend 8 hours just recording how much time you spend on it, and then hopefully that decreases over time the next year and the next year. But taking pictures, I think, is kind of the quickest, easiest, and most rewarding way to kind of monitor. So never give up. The last 5% will continue to grow. So if we leave 5%, we leave 5 individual plants and forget about this invasive project we took on, it'll grow exponentially, and it might be out of control again. So even after you think you fully eradicate it, go back and check. Bringing other people into your projects is a really great way. It's nice when you working with even one other person, you look up and go, oh, wow, twice as much work's done than I did by myself. So pulling other people in your project, and maybe that means you need to go and help them with a project too. So doing this kind of community share with our time and effort. If you are an organization or you do have access to volunteers, volunteers are awesome. They really kick butt. I was really unfortunate to not have my volunteer base this spring because of COVID reasons. Totally understandable, but it was a lot harder, and we were not able to get quite as much done as we liked when we had our volunteers. So if you do have access, I highly encourage it, and then always reward your volunteers when and if we can ever get them back. So you got to be in it for the long term. This is a marathon. Invasive species removals will not happen in a year. So it's when you take this on, know in your mind that you're in this for multiple years. But it can be fun. It's not necessarily a scary and daunting thing. This is a great reason to get out and be on your land, giving back and stewarding basically the community that's providing for us. Really important, tell your story. Let's talk about our invasive species removal projects. We want to learn if you did something that worked. I want to know about that so I can maybe implement that approach into my work in the future. Or maybe you tried something and it didn't work. Please tell us so we don't go and try that same thing. And the more we're talking about this as the other people in our community, even if they're not like somebody that knows about it, just tell them your story. Like, hey, I had some really great success with this. And maybe they'll start thinking about it. But we're a community. We're all in this together. The ecology and the land doesn't have boundaries. So the invasive species you're removing on your property is helping me and it's helping Jason. And we hope the work that we're doing is kind of helping you and helping the ecology of your land also. Yeah, so here's some good online resources I really like to use. CalIPC.org, the UC Davis, UC Davis agriculture site has a great one, invasives.org, and calflora.org. And then a lot of times just doing a simple web search works really well to find, hey, who's tried this method with this invasive plant? You'll probably find a lot of stuff, as I'm sure we're all very aware of in this world. The internet has almost everything. So now, Jason and I just kind of want to go quickly through the top, or what we see as kind of 10 major invaders that we've noticed in Sonoma County, and hopefully this is, will spark something for you guys. So I'm going to pass it on to Jason to kind of take it from here.
Thank you, Devyn. Great job. You can see the complexity involved in this stuff. It's not easy business, and essentially, I'm a contractor for the Sonoma Ecology Center. We go out and approach these things using IPM principles. So it's basically invasive pest management principles, and there's always a proper prescription for each one of these invasive species. So we're going to now dive into some of the techniques for each one of these specific plants. I really appreciated what Devyn mentioned about, herbicide being a last resort, and I think that's really important. So we're going to talk a little bit about that too. I'm going to start with some invasive species that can be controlled manually. So one that I've noticed really proliferate in the fog belt of Sonoma County, or really any area with shade, so it's very prevalent in a coniferous forest, are the ivies. The English ivy is a little different than the Cape ivy. I would say Cape ivy is even a bigger threat to our riparian forest. A lot of times it's in the early emergent phases, and at that point it becomes really important to map and control before it spreads. English ivy, much more widespread. They both can be controlled manually. So depending on the scale, I generally wait until the rainy season, and then I will start to uproot the plant. It is most important to actually initially cut it down from climbing trees. If it's climbing fences, if it's started to climb, it's in its mature phase. The plant actually has two totally distinct phases. So in its juvenile form, it spreads over the ground cover and will try to overtake as much area as it can for the first 3 to 5 years of its life. And then it actually reaches the mature phase where it can reproduce once it starts to climb. So once those plants start to climb, they store more photosynthetic energy. They start producing huge flower sets in generally around December to January. Each one of those giant compound inflorescences ends up generating a ton of toxic berries, which are then distributed by birds all over the place. And we stepped into a pretty major project down there in Santa Cruz, and I decided to take on a seed bank study to show that, to test whether these fruits were actively spreading the plant. And in fact, there is no seed bank to English ivy. So once you remove it, it's generally gone if you get that root material out of there. However, the seeds are very, very viable and will actively spread. So we manually rip it out in the rainy season, pile it upon itself, and let it decompose. Now here's another one, poison hemlock. So this plant loves wet areas. It moves into the riparian forest. It will actively spread. It has a very active seed bank. It's also toxic. It's a member of the Apiaceae, and we have native carrots out there too. So one important distinction is to look for the speckled stalks of poison hemlock. It's the only one out there with this speckled stalk. It is highly toxic, so I would definitely wear gloves when you're removing it, but it's really easy to remove. It has little tiny roots for giant bolts. And if you go out in the wet season, you can make a huge impact just popping these things out and getting them before they go to seed. That lets you leave it all on site. And what we're starting to see is after just a couple years of manual removal, we're starting to win the battle and get ahead of that seed bank trajectory. I would use caution on mowing this, spreading those oils and gases from the plant. It's volatile and poisonous, so just use caution when you're dealing with this. And also, you know, if you have kids, keep them away from this plant. And I think that covers, yes, so that covers the manual removal. Now I'm going to get into some of the nastier plants that we use chemicals on. And chemicals is a last resort for the Sonoma Ecology Center. We will not use chemicals on any plant that can be controlled by other means. It's the last tool in the toolbox for us, and these are some of the most aggressive invasive plants that have really substantial root systems that store a lot of energy. And that's where those chemicals come in key, because they translocate into that vascular tissue and actually start to degrade the energy in the root mass itself. So if you've been out to the coast lately, you've probably seen a proliferation of cordydaria out there, jubata grass and pampas grass mixed throughout the Bay Area. These are wind distributed seeds that can travel a great distance. If they land anywhere with moisture, they will germinate and rapidly spread. If you can get them in their early stages, they are pretty easy to get out with a pickaxe. Or if you have a hedge trimmer, some loppers, we use power hedge trimmers. We take it all the way down to the root ball, and then sometimes we can pry them out and get them out manually. But once they've established giant roots, we're seeing them come back post-fire. we're going to do some sort of foliar application to get that translocation into the root mass. So again, a really good one to control in its early stages before you have to use chemicals. And if you are going to use chemicals, please have a long-term plan to do so. Now here's one overtaking our waterways throughout California. The giant reed Arundo donax, a really aggressive plant. We've got it scattered throughout wine country. It's moving pretty quick. They just got $1 million grant to control it in Yolo County. There are different approaches out there. Basically, this plant, it spreads during the flood season, and plant tissue with meristematic tissues on it at the nodes, or the little root fragments can divide and get carried away during high water and re-root downstream, and they are rapid to grow and overtake surrounding vegetation. There's 2 methods to this. My predecessor had great success foliar treating the entire plant, and we're seeing very good kill rates with that. Another technique being used is to remove all of the biomass and then treat the resprouts. That doubles your labor, but might reduce the amount of herbicide out there. I also wanted to explain with herbicide use, there are 3 types. There's a boom application, which is used in agriculture, where you're seeing a lot of herbicide sprayed out over the landscape indiscriminately. That is really a big threat to our watersheds. Then there are spot applications where you're actually going out with a backpack sprayer and specifically treating individual plants. And then there's something that we call cut and paint, where we, right after cutting a plant, directly apply the chemical to the tissue. And that's what I'm going to touch on in the next one here. These are fire following invasive species. So I think this is something we're really going to want to have on our radar, and I know it's something Devyn's going to get into more depth on. But these are plants we're seeing coming back strong after the fire, especially in the riparian forest, and they're quick to grow and they are hard to kill. And I have tried numerous times to just mechanically take them down and buck up their trunks and try to mess with their tissue flow and function, but they tend to resprout about 100% of the time. If you take down a tree of heaven, it will then cause 10 new tree of heavens to grow from that cut stump, if not more. So these are the plants we're out there doing what we call the cut and paint technique. And what we do is right after we chainsaw it down, we have someone else behind us follow up and literally paint the stump with a very small amount of chemical that then translocates down into the root, and you actually get a kill. There's no sense in spending the resources to go after these things if you're not going to get that end result. So look out for those yellow acacias and those tree of heavens, because they're all over the place and they're spreading quick. All right, thank you. And with that, passing it over to Devyn.
All right, I want to leave some time for Q&A, so I'm going to run through this pretty quick. Stinkwort, or Detrichia gravolens, it is moving pretty prolifically. I think Calypsy just kind of declared this like one of the faster moving invasive species in California. It's been moving a lot along roadsides. It really likes heavily disturbed areas and areas with wet soil. This is a plant that you can mechanically remove. Wear gloves. It's really sticky and smelly, but you want to get these populations while they're early, because they're pretty easy to pop out. You can do it, like kids can be out there working. You're just going to kind of wear some clothes you don't care too much about, and wear gloves, because it'll leave a sticky residue with you. But I highly recommend getting out and hand pulling this. Chemical treatment does work on this. You do need to use a surfactant or something that's going to make the chemical stick to the plant, because it has a lot of these sticky residual things that'll kind of keep the chemical from soaking into the plant. So highly recommend hand pulling, and if it has flowers, bag it, because those flowers, even after it's been pulled, will go to seed, and they will create viable seeds. It's pretty tricky because it looks like a lot like a generic plant, but it's really sticky and the smell will give it away. Oh, that didn't work. All right. Thistle species, yellow star, Italian, milk, bull thistles. They are pretty prolific too. A lot of times you'll see them growing in kind of oak understories. They really like disturbed areas, and you'll see a lot post-fire. They'll kind of show up in the hot spots. These tend to be, some of them are biannuals and some of them are annuals. I think the Italian and star thistle are annuals, milk and bull are biannuals. So repeated mowing can work well on it. Mechanical removal with a pick or a shovel also works really well. And if you get them before the flower is fully open, it's fine to just kind of to leave them there. But if the flower is starting to show the full rosettes of the flower, you can cut the head off, put it in a bag, and leave the vegetative part on the ground, so you don't have to be moving all that biomass. Annual grasses, Medusa head, barb goat grass. I guess not just annual. Harding grass is a perennial grass, but these grasses, if it's annuals, the timed mowing can work really well. If you have access to use prescribed fire and you can work with CAL FIRE or the local prescribed burn associations. Burning for over large pieces of land in a timed way can actually be really successful. We've had about an 80% success rate when we've done prescribed burn on Medusa head, but also hand pulling works well. And so these are kind of the three invasive grasses that are pretty big in Sonoma County. Grasses can be really hard to identify by themselves, so you kind of got to wait until it's showing its full flower, and then you can kind of approach those. Himalayan blackberry, I'm sure we're all really familiar with this. I kind of talked a little bit about it before when I was talking about perennials, and really just timing it so that you are using the removal, the mechanical or chemical, into those summer months when the stored energy in the plant is the most exhausted. Timed mowing repeatedly can get rid of blackberry, but also mowing and then waiting for the resprouts to kind of come up where it's a little bit long, about like knee length, so it has enough vegetation above ground that you can kind of apply a chemical. Works really well. So mechanical in combination with chemical can work well with blackberry. French broom. This one is in the fire area of the Tubbs fire footprint, and also the Kincaid fire footprint. And I'm sure our other fire footprints will seeing a lot of broom. Getting out there early. The nice thing about broom is the first year it germinates, it won't flower. So you actually have, it'll flower in the second year of the second spring of its growth. So if you're starting to see a lot of French broom coming up, you can get out and mechanically remove it. This is a great one to hand pull. There's things out there called weed wrenches that'll help you if they're really big plants. But getting out there and removing this plant while the soil is wet is going to be huge, not waiting till the soil is dry. It's a lot harder to pull that taproot out. And so if you're pulling French broom, and you really want to keep it from breaking at the root structure and really kind of pulling it straight up so you can get the full taproot out, is a best approach, and highly recommend doing it in the spring and winter when the soil is wet. These are kind of just some of our dishonorable mentions. European beach grass, if you're out kind of on the coast. Ice plant is also a coast one. Cape ivy is a really nasty one. I don't think there's a ton of it in Sonoma County right now, which is a good thing. And then kind of wetland ones, if you have marsh wetland area, the cordgrass, pepperweed, and water primrose, as we have a lot in the Laguna area with that water primrose. So those are kind of some other invasive species that to keep your eyes out for. Cool. And that's it for us.
Excellent. Well, thank you both. And I want to be conscious of the time. We are set to end in 15 minutes. So I want to take some of the questions that folks have posed and direct them to you. So Actually, going right off what you were just speaking about, Devyn, one question is, do you have any advice for minimizing Ludwigia? So that is that water primrose that you were just talking about?
Mechanical removal, being in a waterway, I would not want to apply chemicals to it, but getting in there and actually just like mechanically pulling all that vegetated out and putting it in a pile in a drier area. You can cover it to kill the biomass so it won't spread. That is one of the, I am fortunate enough to work at Pepperwood where we don't have a ton of waterways. So it's not one I personally have worked with a lot. I know people at the Laguna Foundation have, and they can have some success, but it's also really fast growing. So getting on it early and mechanically removing it. I don't know, Jason, you have anything to add with the water primrose?
Yeah, I've just started addressing Ludwigia for the first time, and I'm really trying to gauge how it reproduces and spreads. I think it has an extensive root network, but it surges with a ton of biomass in the spring and summer. So we have just started stripping all that biomass out and trying to do so before the flower matures to seed. So I'm keeping a close eye on it and gauging the effectiveness of those efforts. And one thing I do know, I've been trying to reach out to Laguna Foundation to find out more about their successes and losses there. And I think one thing that did go south with them is they had a large wetland. They brought big equipment in there to excavate the whole area, and it has resurged in those areas. So I don't know if that's coming in from clonal growth off, existing root matter, or if it's actually actively reseeding. So these are the sort of conversations we really need to have for some of these invasives where the verdict isn't clearly out yet.
Great, yeah, definitely, working together as you've both mentioned. Another question, which I think is probably pretty applicable that a lot of people wonder, is there a more benign chemical alternative to Roundup that could be used to kill the taproots of biennials and perennials? For example, lots of dandelion type plants that when I dig them out, they seem to just come up again with the remaining roots.
So
do you want to field that?
Yeah, let's stab at it first. So we use a chemical that is, it's Astra-specific. So anything that is in the Asteraceae family, it'll harm those, but it won't harm some of the other broadleaf or grass species. That chemical is, I wouldn't say, any less toxic than glyphosate. So it is still a chemical use. I've heard people using like a vinegar base situation. I personally have never had success with that. I've heard people say that they had. So if you're dealing on a small scale in a backyard setting and you really don't want to use chemicals because it's close to your home, I would suggest using a vinegar base or maybe vinegar salt complex where it might stop the flow of nutrients. I personally have never seen that succeed, but I've heard stories where it has, especially on a small scale where you can actually apply a lot of it if it's like in your backyard setting.
Yeah, I think there's, two types of the ways herbicides function. So I think in this case with something like dandelion that's probably right around your home or out in your landscape, you probably don't want to use some really hardcore chemical for control, and you might not have to. It's kind of surprising how many people just buy their Roundup from Home Depot and then proceed to soak their landscape with it. But I think that really in this case, for something, dandelions are weedy, but are they actually actively overtaking other native vegetation? Are they displacing natives around them? While it's existing and it's weedy, I don't know whether it's really truly actively invasive. So for things like that, I would highly recommend like a high vinegar natural herbicide like that. And what that's going to do is it's going to fry the foliar tissue. So you're going to see above ground growth. but what it's not going to do is translocate into the vascular pathways to actually interrupt the root energy. And some of these really nasty invasives, that's where we rely on the chemicals for that. So I think for these more like benign invasives, absolutely those vinegar cayenne concoctions, I'd say give it a shot.
Great. Yeah, and I see someone has also added in the comments, I think, Jason, you were getting at this as well. The vinegar needs to be very high acidity. It's a special product that you can't get at the grocery store. So that's something else to keep in mind. And then another question we had was, any advice on talking to neighbors who want to introduce non-natives or remove natives and avoid creating an antagonistic relationship?
Yeah, it's a really tricky subject, especially depending on the personality of your neighbor. But I think opening with conversation and just asking, hey, like, why are you doing that? And just kind of hearing their response, and then, you know, telling them what you're doing on your land and the way you're perceiving it, and maybe inviting them over to kind of do some work on your land, or do a little tour of your land, and just really making it an open conversation. And do not ever feel, you don't want them to feel like you're telling them what to do. That is just going to make it difficult. So I think just having a conversation and letting them talk to you about why and understanding their reasons, and then just explaining your reasons. And, you know, it's not necessarily always going to be successful. You might not be able to convince them. And I think just understanding that is a big portion of it. But if they're open to it, maybe sending them some resources, sending them to the Cal IPSI site, talking to why you feel it's important, but also being sure to listen.
Yeah, I feel like, you know, sometimes it's really hard to rally people's interests on this stuff. And I think sometimes I'll try to get traction coming from it from an ecological perspective, but a lot of times people don't grasp those concepts or might have other opinions about it, in which case I tend to lean on the fire fuel subject, because that is something that has a lot of traction right now, and it's absolutely true. A lot of these invasive plants are flashy fuels or ladder fuels, and communities are going to need to work together to address these fuel loads. So we're going to need watershed approaches to actually get ahead of this stuff. So I think coming from the fire fuel perspective is something I would advise. Another thing I would advise, if it's a plant that they paid for or something they appreciate for some reason, I think it's Cal IPSI has the Plant Right program where they suggest native alternatives to invasive species. So maybe it could be so far as you're providing that new plant to replace the other one, or maybe just explaining how, you know, your fellow neighbors have been working on controlling this population and spending, you know, X amount of resources on it, and we'd really like to, you know, unite this effort. And generally, if you can get some traction, get a couple homeowners to start making motions, that goes a long way, and word of mouth can really pick up those efforts.
Excellent. And then we've just got a couple minutes here, so maybe if one of you could address any suggestions on eradication of bindweed, the sort of wild morning glory with the little white flower.
Yeah, do you want me to touch on it, Devin? I don't know if you've gone after that one. That's a nasty one.
I've not.
Yeah, it usually lands fairly low on our prioritization because it's not going to really overtake and displace natives to the same degree, but it is sure hard to get a handle on. So, you know, I think it's fulfilling the niche role of calisthesias. So all our wild morning glories come on really strong post-fire. So I kind of see bindweed filling all disturbed areas, and I have heard of it completely overtaking restoration sites. So I think before you go in there and start planting and trying to restore habitat, this is an example of controlling that invasive first, so it doesn't then negate all of your other efforts. So I've just been hand pulling it, and it's a rough one because it's out right now when the ground is so hard. So as you start pulling it, you're not getting the root material either. But I'm thinking by pulling it, I'm stopping its ability to sexually reproduce. And I'm also hoping by pulling it, I'm exhausting its root energy over time. But I'm just kind of tracking my efforts and marking where I'm doing it, kind of like Devyn suggested with pin flags or rock, and just kind of watching it over time to see if you're actually getting ahead of it. I think once I know that I can't control it that way, then I'll start looking into chemical alternatives.
Great. Well, I want to thank you both so much for sharing your vast wealth of knowledge today. And I also want to thank everyone for joining us this morning. We have recorded this, so it will be up on our YouTube channel, which you can find here at Pepperwood Foundation. We will also share the link with everyone who registered. And I invite you to check out our website and see what upcoming events we have going on. Lots more in store through the fall. And again, yeah, thank you so much to Jason for joining us today as a guest, and Devyn, of course, as well. And yeah, if either of you have closing remarks, I'll open it up to you.
Well, just thanks so much, Pepperwood, for having me, and keep up all the great work, everyone. And you know where to find me if you have other questions. We are just parked right by Glen Ellen in the Sonoma Valley, and we're branching out all over the county. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you everyone for at least, caring enough about this subject and biodiversity to listen to us ramble on about invasive plants. But I think we think it's extremely important work, and like Jason said, it's also a fire factor too and contribute to these fuels. So even if we're not in it for the ecological reasons, thinking about it for those fire fuel reasons. And my email is on the Pepperwood website, so if you do have any more specific invasive species questions, please feel free to reach out to me, and I'm happy to field them as I can. So thank you all very much.